the last thing I want to talk about is violence. Aboriginal women make up only 0.3% of all Australian women, but they account for 14% of all hospitalisations for assault nationally. The mothers of Northern Territory children are 48 times more likely to be admitted to hospital for reasons of assault than all Australian women. And in the 2009-10 year, the rate at which Aboriginal women were admitted was 80 times that of non-Aboriginal women for hospitalisation for assault. And child substantiation for child abuse is 7 times higher in the NT than elsewhere, and that's rising. So we've got challenges still with violence, we've got challenges, but the big challenge overall is child development, child neglect, and chronic understimulation. And there's some that we can do. I want to show you what we can do about that, because we can make a big difference with that. Before I go into specific social determinants, though, I want to say something, and this is going to be brief. I'm not going to go through this whole graph, but in terms of the political economy of health, I think it's a really important concept that we understand the link between economic policy and the way in which power and resources are shared in society and health outcomes. And to do that, I start with that. You probably all know the story of John Snow back in London in 1851 in the cholera epidemic when he took the handle off the water pump. So I won't go into that part of the story. But basically, before we knew bacteria existed, which wasn't until the 1890s, he worked out that cholera was being spread by people drinking water from a particular water pump in Soho. And once the handle was taken off that water pump, the cholera disappeared. But does anyone know why the water out of that water pump and for the people in that area was causing cholera, whereas the King and the Queen and the people in Kensington never got cholera from their water supply? Does anyone know what was happening to the water supply in London in 1851? What's that? But the link between, I want to bring back the link between economic policy and the water supply. And basically, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in about 1770, and this was the first era of what we now call neoliberalism or economic liberalism. So the economic orthodoxy was small government, privatise everything, low taxes, and the government should never intervene in the market. Let the market go, the market will generate wealth and it'll be magically distributed and everyone will be better off. That was the economic policy in London. So they privatised the water supply. So there were 2 private companies delivering water. One delivered water to Kensington, the King and the Queen, and the rich people, and that water was separated from sewage because they didn't want to drink water mixed with sewage. But the water supply in Soho, which is the poor area, was mixed with raw sewage. There was no separation. And that's because if you're trying to make a profit out of water to large numbers of poor people, well, then you don't put a lot of effort into making sure it's clean. So the privatisation of the water supply, which was economic policy, was a major threat to public health. And so, having learnt the lesson, rich people didn't want to get cholera. They realised they had to do something, and the world's first Public Health Act was put in place back then, and that act regulated the market in all sorts of ways. It includes the need for proper sanitation, proper sewage, clean water, adequate housing, a minimum wage, because they related the minimum wage to nutrition. So they basically realised if they didn't guarantee a minimum wage, people didn't eat the right food. There's a lot of progressive things in that act. So that was the beginning of the realisation that you can't just let the market go on its own. There has to be social goals and there has to be a regulated market. And I want to come back to that because some of the major public health issues facing us, whether it be alcohol or food, is about regulating big business if we're going to achieve public health outcomes, and that's very relevant to Aboriginal health. So basically though, this first wave of liberalism rolled on, world inequality grew to massive levels, and when the economy becomes grossly unequal, it leads to consequences that are quite clear throughout history. It leads to war, led to the Great Depression, it's led to the global financial crisis again. So we've gone through a period of massive inequality, and then from the Second World, but once the Second World War was over and the bomb was dropped and they had the meeting at Bretton Woods in England in 1944, under the leadership of John Maynard Keynes and John Galbraith, and you might have heard in the global financial crisis everyone was saying back to Keynes, their leadership about what to do to regulate the global economy and to fix the currency exchange and the various things they put in place led to about 30, 40 years of sustained economic growth across the world, and inequality dramatically declined and health improved everywhere. Another key point to this graph though, so that was, if you like, the foundations of what we call social liberalism. But then that was all undone when Richard Nixon decided to float the US dollar and break the Bretton Woods Agreement, and so we entered a new era of deregulation, and that's the era we're still in now, an era of, again, this idea, it's now called neoliberalism, and neoliberalism comes from new liberalism, because it's not the first time we've had the same economic policies. So neoliberalism is about small government, low taxes, privatise, letting the market generate wealth, and the wealth will be magically distributed. And don't intervene, let big business do what it can, and certainly don't intervene for common good or public health purposes. Interestingly, when the water pump handle was taken off, in order to do that, the government had to pass legislation to give itself the power to remove the handle off the water pump, because that was a private company, and the government had actually legislated itself out of the ability to intervene in the affairs of a private company completely. So they had to pass new legislation to give the government the power to do that. We're not quite as bad as that now. Government do have a role and they do regulate the economy, but we have entered another major era of global inequality. I want to come back to that because that's another foundation issue in terms of Aboriginal health and addressing, closing the gap.